This is permitting, abundance, and the race to build resilience. Hopefully you're all in the right room. If you're expecting a different session, stay anyways. This should be a really good one. The goal of this conversation is to think about how we build climate infrastructure and whether we're going fast enough to meet the rising risks. So a lot of folks are going to be familiar with Ezra Klein and Thompson's Abundance, book that came out a couple of years ago that talks about how the U.S. has really become paralyzed by process, slowing development of critical resilience projects, and yet environmental law experts also are cautioning us that reforms often overstate the role of environmental review and risk weakening safeguards without improving outcomes. So that's the conversation we want to get into today and really explore the trade-offs, how to streamline permitting responsibly and accelerate resilient infrastructure while also avoiding the sacrifice of environmental protection and community trust along the way. So I'm joined by 4 exceptional panelists who I'll introduce, and then I've got a number of questions for them. So first we have Robert Joyce, who's Director of Policy and Political Strategy for Abundance New York, where he recently led the development of their policy agenda, came out of the U.S. Department of Commerce, really specializing in industrial policy and economic development. Pietrzak, who I've had the pleasure of working with for a number of years on waterfront issues, is a civil engineer and head of Thornton Tomasetti's Sustainable and Resilience Practice, where she works on architecture, engineering, science, and digital innovation projects, much of which is focused on waterfront and climate resilience. Hilary Semel is an environmental law and policy professional in the region with cross-sectoral issues, working on cross-sectoral issues such as climate adaptation and resiliency. She's currently the Director and General Counsel of the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination, where she oversees environmental impact review of New York City's major infrastructure projects. And then finally, we have Shino Tanikawa, another great partner of Waterfront Alliance, who leads the New York City Soil and Water Conservation Districts in their green infrastructure, urban soils, and environmental education programs. So we've got 4 folks who work on these permitting issues, work on climate resilience projects across their careers. I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation with them. So we're going to start the panel with kind of a shared premise that climate risk is accelerating faster than our systems for planning and for permitting and for delivering resilience are keeping up. The disagreement really is around why that's the case and what to do about it. So we want to explore not just how to build faster, but how to build durably, equitably, and credibly without sacrificing environmental protection or public trust. So I'm going to start with a question for everybody, and we'll just go right down the line here. Climate impacts are already here. In many cases, we have spent a decade or more planning and delivering resilience projects. I mean, we started talking about the space outside the windows here in Wagner Park just after Hurricane Sandy, and that process really started in 2013, 2014. Just finished construction within the last 6 months. So when we look at the gap between urgency and delivery, what's actually slowing us down? Robert, I'll turn to you.
Yeah. I'll underline starting with the climate risk part, right? So we've got a number of hurricanes and recent storms that have come through New York, and the difference between our framework for how we respond to an urgent crisis when the hurricane is in the harbor there, right? The mayor will declare a state of emergency. The governor will declare a state of emergency. The president, under the Stafford Act, will declare a state of emergency and then a disaster. That waives a whole bunch of administrative procedures. It waives a ton of requirements. It allows for something called mission assignments within the federal government, where FEMA can task other agencies that have capability to execute on specific missions and backfill their budgets with funding. So we can move things, we can move people, we can move money very, very quickly when it comes to times of crisis. And then you look at that framework that is well worn you look how quickly the government can move under those circumstances. And then you look at how we take climate resiliency, and you'll see that it is an extremely different framework that is built not around moving quickly, but built around giving lots of opportunities for folks involved, sometimes critical stakeholders, and oftentimes for great reasons, the ability to hit pause anywhere along the way. And the outcome we see is, you know, what we get from the process. It's a process that's built not around achieving an outcome quickly like that, but around around thoroughness and around you know, a feeling of satisfaction with the process and a faith that a really thorough process will yield a strong outcome as opposed to valuing speed. So that's awesome.
And Julie, the gap between urgency and delivery.
Yeah, so I think from a practitioner standpoint, there's no silver bullet, we all know, that is going to satisfy 100% of the stakeholders we were discussing just before this. So from a practitioner standpoint, it's really important to understand what performance objectives need to be met, and that will help with urgency and delivery, both in the same. And so what I mean by that is when we're talking about resilience, we really want to understand each individual owner's perspective. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather than taking a prescriptive approach to the problem, taking more a performance-based approach. So understanding what is the performance objective that needs to be met. When we're building to code, we know that that's going to give us life safety, but beyond that, if we need to have continued operations or quicker recovery, that's when we want to understand what those parameters are and then design for that performance approach. So I think when we can really talk about these conditions early and understand what are the objectives from a performance perspective, in the very early conversations, as soon as the project is kicked off, that's where those targets can be continually looked at as the urgency is in the meeting the targets. And I think that then there's a balance between having the right delivery method for the project that's going to be more custom and bespoke.
And Hilary, the same question to you. The gap between urgency and resiliency.
Well, the gap that I see, particularly with climate resiliency, is that addressing climate resiliency really takes, and a lot of other things in our modern environment, but it really takes
Yes, and I have to preface by saying I'm probably the least qualified person to answer this question. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an environmental lawyer. I don't review permits or I don't build things. So just a preface. And I'm probably going to say things that are probably not going to land well with some people and not popular exactly, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. The political system is definitely a barrier. I think we have a tendency to see projects in 4-year timeframes. Anything that happens past your political term is not an urgent matter. What's urgent to many of the politicians is re-election 4 years down the road, which I think is a barrier. But also, it matters where the disaster happens. Many of us in this room have known climate is changing 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Yet, it's recent when we finally agreed that actually climate is changing, and it's more recent that we all agreed that humans are causing climate change. It took so many decades to arrive at where we are today. Part of it is because people who suffer from the impact of climate change don't have the power to dictate the narrative. People in power are comfortable. Their homes are not getting flooded, or if they get flooded, they can fix it right away. I'm actually amazed by the speed by which this resiliency project happened right outside. That, to me, was like, wow, that happened really fast. And it's because this is it's the power center of New York City. We got Wall Street, we got financial district. So things did get fixed fast, even though people who live here probably didn't think it was fast. But in other areas where flooding is a normal, course of the day at this point, things are not getting addressed. So I think the basic underlying inequities in our society definitely leads to delays, and there's a difference in speed by which these resiliency projects happen depending on where the project is.
And we knew you'd give an answer like that, which is why you're on this panel. We want that community perspective across all of the work of Waterfront Alliance. So Robert, the abundance argument says that America and in cities like New York have become paralyzed by process. From your perspective, what are the actual points where permitting and environmental review genuinely do slow climate resilience projects down? And then on the flip side of that, where are we actually overstating their role in slowing the process?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with building off of Shino's answer actually to say that it is because we are trying to capture a political process within a administrative process, right? Like what we're mechanically doing when we're taking a long time in getting a very thorough community input process and allowing lots of people to comment and allowing lots of veto points is we are building small p political support for doing a big thing in a community in the built environment where people really care about what their community looks like, what it feels like, all of it. And rightfully so, and that is completely fair. And now somehow over decades of litigation and court rulings, that has been pigeonholed into this environmental review process where really if we had a political system that was working and we could point at elected representatives and say they are the ones responsible for large government projects. If you don't like what's happening in your community, take it up with your elected representatives. Then that would be great, but we don't have that. And and instead we have this quasi-judicial, quasi-administrative process where when they want to, the elected representatives can take a step back from and say, that's not me, that's the department of whatever. And then the department can say, we're stuck, we have to follow the rules too, and it can't go any faster, et cetera. And it just kind of blurs the lines of accountability, I would say. So, I think the abundance, thinkers, and I think, the abundance movement, insofar as it exists, gets a lot of flack for, you're singling out the environmental review process, and, the argument is basically, well, if we didn't care so much about the environment, we could just clear cut the forests and build trains and whatnot, right? Like, that's not really what we're going for here. What we're going for is, picking all parts of where the process is failing us and saying, this process does not fit the outcomes that we're looking for. If the outcome that we're looking for is resilient infrastructure to protect people from death in times of climate emergency, we would build a very different process than what it looks like now. But we haven't built a process. We've actually just passed one law and then litigated for 50 years. And we've gotten a kind of disparate hodgepodge of court rulings and then agency reactions and at times overreactions to court rulings and, a concern about winning lawsuits as opposed to, quickly delivering a product and an outcome that would serve people and protect human life. So I think that, is overall what we're looking at. But then when you look at kind of what is actually slowing us down at different parts, it is not just the environmental review process. There's a capital construction process in the city that is deeply broken. There's lots of audits and lots of findings on that. The Mayor Adams administration had a task force with good recommendations about this to speed some of this up. Civil service reform is part of this, right? Like, there's so many components of what is slowing us down, and environmental review and permitting is one part of that. But the perspective that the abundance argument is trying to offer here is saying, let's agree on the outcome we're looking for, and let's design us a process that can reliably and fairly get us that outcome.
I have a response there, but also a little bit of comment too. So, from my perspective, particularly with resiliency projects and delay, right? I don't even like to say the word. Is many of these projects, and many of my partners are in the room, are because of the funding, or they're in water work, or just the nature of the project themselves, are often collaborations at a multi-jurisdictional collaborations between local, state, and federal government, and we all have different environmental review processes. Even if the city is really implementing the State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQRA, the city admittedly has taken it to a very high level, and we have our own processes. Sometimes people think they're completely different, even though they're the same. So, from an environmental law perspective, the overarching statutes do allow each jurisdiction to rely on each other's environmental review, but because of regulations, because of technical staff comfort with approvals, because of politics, and we all know what's happening with the National Environmental Policy Act right now, but thanks to our friends at the state DEC, we are New York State and buttressing the environmental review process that way with regard to environmental justice and cumulative impacts or disproportionate effects on disadvantaged communities. But I've been because I have seen where this has slowed, particularly resiliency projects, down because, for example, the technical staff, including people in my own world, get uncomfortable relying on another jurisdiction's analysis, or they're worried about what their superiors and the headquarters may think. I really feel strongly, speaking from the New York City perspective, and local government is the best to really listen to the concerns of the community, engage with the community during that process. And I really feel like we could make some huge gains if we could convince politicians to make the process more streamlined by relying on each other's reviews more. And also, I feel that that would also give the city and the state more ability to exempt projects that we know do not have the environmental impacts that people are concerned about. Many of which would really help communities that need the resiliency projects, but don't need huge infrastructure like this because they aren't the financial center. And if we could, like, for example, pesco barriers could be exempted looking forward to DEC's and the state secret amendments in the new state budget, because they mentioned something like that, but I don't know what it is yet. But I think that we can make some real gains both in process and with our obligations to the communities, and basically it just takes politics to make it happen.
So I want to pull on your experience, Julie, as engineer on these projects, and talk about not only kind of where the process slows down, but where that slowing down is actually doing important work to help create better projects. So I mean, Waterfront Alliance did a survey, and I'll preface this with not peer reviewed, not a huge sample size, but we asked folks in the design field on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being the permitting processes. We were specifically looking at DEC, SBS, and Army Corps. 0 on this scale being the process does not improve the environment or does not improve the project's environmental impact, and 100 being totally changed the project. We did it so much better as a result. Our survey came back with the average was 45. So there are a lot of folks who are just going through this process, not seeing that the process is actually making projects better. I'm curious, on projects that you've worked with, where does this process actually help create better projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. How many folks in the room have actually read the book Abundance? It's interesting because in that book, there's a lot of comparison of the U.S. to China. And so, of course, the reason China is so ahead is because they are kind of putting process aside and moving forward with building and constructing very quickly. So we don't want to be that fast. There's reasons we're not that fast. But it is an interesting problem because, as I mentioned earlier, there's no silver bullet. There's so many different comparisons that need to be made. I think from a practitioner standpoint, we have a responsibility to really make sure that we are outlining all of the various options very, very early, and then it's essentially an exercise in effective communication. So essentially, what we need to be doing is right from the beginning with design criteria, understanding what is the right design criteria, knowing that this will be a longer process, not just permitting, but construction and getting all of the authorities that have jurisdiction involved in stakeholder engagement. I mean, it is a process. So for the sake of speed, it might not be the right answer, but really having the right people in the room early is what needs to happen. And we do that well in some instances, and maybe not so well in others. One thing that comes to mind that's really challenging is, I think it's no secret between Battery Park City, where we're sitting now, and Red Hook, the design criteria is vastly different for what's being built. It has a lot to do with that benefit cost analysis that is a result of FEMA's toolkit. Those things are really hard to get around. And so, I think in addition to the public sector, there needs to be private involvement as well so that we can understand the full problem, work with individual property owners, in addition to these community-wide projects that are federally funded and kind of restricted by property values, essentially, and maybe where the financial center is located, there's more protection than in other lesser locations with less property value. But really what needs to happen is identifying all of these things up front very early, understanding the future climate risk, weighing that against cost versus operations and maintenance. That's a huge piece and lesson learned through projects that I've worked on, of bringing those people in the room as early as possible and understanding those memorandums of understanding of who's going to operate and maintain the project as well. We can all have the best intentions and design something wonderful, and if it can't be operated or maintained, then it's all moot. And so just understanding all of those pros and cons and being able to communicate that really early on. One thing I would love to see more of, and we strive to do this, it's very challenging, is also understanding the return on investment costs, so the cost of doing nothing or doing less, and what those repair costs and potentially demolition costs could also look like in comparison to design criteria. So being able to understand those things early, communicate, that really helps at least everyone get in a level playing field to make the right decisions and navigate these
so I wanted to you focus there at the end on kind of the return on investment, which goes back to Chino's point in the first response that a place like Battery Park City has very different outcomes than, as you pointed out, Red Hook, and there's other places where no climate resilience infrastructure would be done. The question here is on the list for Hilary, but I'd like to ask Chino first and then go to Hilary. While we often blame the environmental review process on delay, it's also one of the biggest opportunities that communities have for participation. So from where you sit, where does that process work well in opening up opportunities for participation, and where would reform still help us without sacrificing community engagement and involvement that's genuine and not superficial?
Well, I don't know if this answer is going to address that, but I think engaging the community from the get-go is the way to build any public project, right? When the government agency, let's say DEP, wants to build something for not resiliency necessary, but stormwater infrastructure, before you come up with a design, location, siting, and all that, involve the community from the very start of the project. That way, your review process is probably going to be quicker because you have the buy-in of the local people who actually bring a lot of knowledge to the project. These are people who live on the block, in the neighborhood. They know when it floods. They know what happens when it rains. It's that information that agency folks don't always have because they don't have the human power to do that kind of data collection. So if you bring them in at the beginning of the project and actually incorporate their knowledge into the project, then I would assume the project duration can be shortened in that way. So I would see, and by the time secret process moves its way through and public comment comes, that is a very dense document that even I wouldn't be able to intelligently comment on. But if you're involving me from the very beginning of the project that's happening down my block, then I may not even have to comment by the time it makes it to that point, right? So there is something to be said about co-creating these projects together with the people who live in that neighborhood. But one thing that I want to mention, it's not related to this question, but while we mention cost benefit and return on investment, a lot of times the environmental community makes an argument that the cost benefit actually doesn't include all the benefits because we don't have dollar amounts associated with many of the benefits that we see in many of the green infrastructure related projects, right? So yes, that is the driving force for many of the projects, but we also have to remember there are a lot of benefits that we don't attach dollar figures to. And somehow we need to account for that as well when we're selecting different types of projects. Is that good enough of an answer?
Yeah, well, just quickly to address that point, it does have to do with cost, but I've definitely been trying to, everybody in the city, in my office, and with our partner agencies, been trying to also in environmental reviews, even if we can't quantify the value, tell people what the benefits of the project are too. Like, sometimes, people, they may still have concerns, but we have to point out that there are benefits, as well as impact. We get very focused on impacts, but we don't look at benefits. And I would, agree with both Julie and Chino is that I think the projects that I've seen go well, and the one that specifically I'm thinking in terms of a resiliency project that is the downtown Far Rockaway rezoning. And I would say that project, first of all, you had a very engaged, knowledgeable politician. I'll hand it to Borough President Donovan Richards, who was the council member at the time. He really dug in with the, other electeds in the area. And, it's a very diverse neighborhood. just went there and looked at the Queens Library branch in Far Rockaway, and it's amazing, and it's a resilient building, and the community was using it, and all the infill development for, you know, public transportation and connection to transit is happening, and it looked great. You know, and I think that went pretty smoothly, and I think, you know, going back to the education piece and the performance objective piece, if the community knows what the project is, knows what and this is very hard with resiliency, because I remember, I'm now going back to the project that I personally lived through, and everybody who works with me has heard this a million times, but I live next to the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, and I was involved in the public engagement before I worked at the city, but as a resident, and, you know, that was definitely a reaction to Sandy. You know, in the beginning, it was HUD money to protect NYCHA housing, and also to address some of the CSO issues. Everybody was really on board, no matter where they lived, because everybody got flooded out at that time. But I remember, even an expert like myself, I didn't know what the resiliency guidelines were. I didn't know what they were designing the project to. And I remember even asking somebody at a public engagement meeting. And because of process, because of politics, because of funding, it took a very long time to get to that project, where I felt like years later people had forgotten we were even doing a resiliency project, because then everybody got involved with what the park was going to look like, and, you know, the bridges, the parking, you know, the squirrels. Everybody hears my thing about the squirrels. And there was a litigation as well, but and now the park is open and almost open, really great. But the point was, like, it became much, in my opinion, just, you know, from a bird's eye view, it became messier, and it became, you know, there was a real concerted effort to have great public engagement on that project, but because everybody was unclear at the beginning of what the project was supposed to be doing, it kind of spiraled out of control, you know, or took longer. It was delayed, I would say the word. It was delayed in delivery.
So, and I'll open this one up to anyone who wants to respond to it, but I want to expand one of the questions on here, and pull a couple things that you've shared so far. So, code prioritizes life safety as its priority. Community participation is going to prioritize on-the-ground experience. We see in Waterfront Alliance's work, in Coney Island, the flood maps and where people are telling us it floods on our Coney Island Creek project, they don't match particularly well. There were a couple recent basement flooding deaths. I want to say in Inwood or Washington Heights. They are not on any flood maps. But that's not. But the code is going to follow largely the existing maps, not the lived experience of participants in the engagement process. So, how do we change the process so that you are actually capturing what matters to communities as kind of part of environmental reform?
I will jump in quickly. Just a few things you said brought to mind. And again, I think most people are aware of this, but we're talking a lot about coastal resiliency projects that were in response to Sandy. And so Sandy had this huge storm surge, but less than 1 inch of rainfall. So the projects were thinking about storm surge and not so much precipitation. Although now, in the past 10 years, we've seen all these cloudburst events, and that's actually been more impactful. So these properties that are not mapped, you know, you can be 200 feet above sea level somewhere in Queens and just be in the low point of your watershed, and you're seeing massive flooding, and you're nowhere near a FEMA zone. So it's, again, it's not easy, it's super challenging, but I think the benefit of bringing in as many people into the process early is to get these different worldviews so that you can see a problem from multiple perspectives, because you need that lived experience, you need the science and the data, you need to understand the changes of future climate risk, and there's some probabilities associated that you need to encounter and understand this like statistical analysis piece as well. So bringing all of these different experts plus the community, the lived experience, and then again this operations and maintenance component and different diverse views so that you understand what's happened in the past, what the objectives are, and then what potentially is changing in the future, and really kind of looking out as far as you can, as practical as possible.
Others want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and I think we have to, I'm talking sort of as a city government, even though I'm not a city government person. We have to operationalize using existing resources to reach people on the ground. What I mean is there's community-based organizations everywhere. There are faith-based organizations everywhere. And I think New York City DEP has started doing some of this work. It's reaching out to those faith-based organizations, community-based organizations to reach people on the ground. And if we just make that, that's what your normal operation is you reach out to electeds, but also these community-based organizations so that you can get on-the-ground information, then we can go somewhere, right? We don't have to start everything from scratch. DEP folks doesn't have to walk the streets to talk to residents. There are existing communication structure that the agencies can use.
I would say the same thing. I mean, a lot of it is, in New York City, agency coordination. We're a medium country in terms of how many agencies we have, and I think definitely I've seen after Sandy a real shift, particularly in the policy offices at the health department and city planning and the mayor's office of climate and environmental justice to it's not just sea level rise and flooding, it's heat, it's all sorts of health symptoms related to climate change, and really engaging through every lens, particularly with environmental justice, to engage the community and the community groups and figuring out where those spots are, and what the community wants to see in terms of addressing those. So, but as most people in environmental policy that needs political willpower to keep happening, and environment tends to be everybody wants a good environment, right? But within relatively, right? But unless something happens, people don't keep that agenda pushed forward. It's kind of like a soft agenda in many ways, and so I feel like it's important to keep it at it's one of those high priority, low urgency type of things, and to keep it high priority, high urgency within the technical agencies and the policymakers in government.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, I'm up here in this kind of advocacy role with Abundance New York. This is the first job I've had outside of government. My whole career has been in government, working on these things in different capacities, including for FEMA, and I worked in Congress for different members of Congress, and what was so fascinating to me was the kind of separation of what is inherently a political process and a political deal making that is going on within these communities around these projects from the politicians who have to go to these communities and get elected and get votes, and they know who leaders in very small areas are. They know who's gonna stand up for things. They know who the smaller organizations are oftentimes, and in one particular project working for a senator's office, it was fascinating that the Army Corps of Engineers was doing this project where they were redredging and reinforcing a canal that went through a community, and they came in with a plan to do a 8-foot wall around the canal, and it was for storm surge, and that's the design code that they had come up with, and the kind of, the engineering behind it all seemed really solid. And when that plan was released, there was immediately a ton of threats of lawsuits from the community to stop this and pause it with every kind of lawsuit that they can throw at it. And, the senator I worked with got involved, and basically people were mad that they jogged along the canal and they would not be able to see over the seawall. And so the deal was, okay, make the seawall 4 feet instead, and the project can go forward. And then we had to then pigeonhole that political handshake deal into this, design process and environmental review process, and we had to orchestrate a kind of formal community comment period and get that deal put forward in the comment period, and then, you know, that's the design that went forward, and it was all kind of nonsense. When really what was needed, you know, it is not the 100% solution. It is not the best solution for climate resilience, the deal that was struck there, but it was the best deal with what was possible politically in that community in that moment. And 4 feet is a lot better than no feet. And speed is of the essence. So, you know, there's not room in the current process to just do politics, cut a deal, and move forward. You know, and that's, I think that's a huge shortfall that we just need to allow for and build into it. And it's like kind of treated like it's dirty or you know, needs to be, you know, kept hush hush and off paper and all of this. And you get the work gets done on a lot of phone calls and relationships and all of this. Like, just do politics. It's fine. Like, we live in a democracy. Like, it's okay.
So I'm going to ask one lightning round question for each person, and then we've got about 12 or so minutes left. I'd love to open up for questions from the audience. So as we go through this last question, start to think about what questions you might have for our panelists. So Hilary, you warned us to not blame one thing. So I'm going to ask you, if you could change one thing, what would it be? What is one change to the permitting or review process that would meaningfully speed up climate resilience projects without undermining environmental protection or trust? We can just go straight down the line, starting with Robert.
That's a hard one, but I think I would say what I said before is if it's a, well, I'll do 2 buckets. If it's a multi-jurisdictional project, conform state and federal, which is almost impossible, but laws, and just delegate to the local government, you know, with, you know, maybe there's some check-in process, but, you know, I have faith in the local government, let's put it that way. But, and have it, and let the lead agency in environmental review make the decisions, and not have, you know, 3 different documents, and they all look different, and no one knows what's going, you know, and everybody has their multiple decision points in every type of jurisdiction. For projects that have one jurisdiction, I really think, like, looking at, you know, environmental review, I say it's the statue that everybody loves to hate and hates to love, because if you love the project, you hate how long it takes to do the review. You hate the project, you love that you can use the environmental review process to litigate against it. But it's a great process because it's about transparency. It's not planning. It's about transparency. It's about showing the community what's going to happen when a plan is decided or proposed, and what we can do, if possible, to minimize, or if practicable, if I'm using the legal term, to minimize the impact. And I really think, you know, SECRA is 50 years old, as some of you know in the audience. What people are concerned about in communities, as we all know, have changed over time. New York City in particular has taken this practice to, you know, it's a whole community and profession, and we do it very well, and we're very, you know, I think we can really have the knowledge to identify what impacts are important to people, what doesn't have impacts. We can really refine the process so that the projects that we know are not going to have impacts, but we can deliver very quickly. We do not have to go through an environmental review for the projects that we know. We can have more of a light touch, you know. We have a process for that, and then the ones that need the really robust environmental impact review process, we can get out ahead, educate the community, be very specific about where that process is going, and not have all these, have a spin out like Robert was talking about.
All right, and to finish out the lightning round, one sentence maybe from Robert, Julie, and Chino. One change to speed up the process without sacrificing what matters.
Sure. We really like what the governor has proposed on SECRA reform with regard to housing specifically, and we like it because it's informed by a look back and saying, in infill areas, when the projects are a certain size, there's almost never a finding of significant environmental impact. So let's just go ahead and looking forward on, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, like it's a duck, like let's just do it. We don't need to check again. Like we need that kind of look back and adjustment to what is type 2, what does not get reviewed, and we've got to just go back and review that all the time. And I think you can sweep a whole bunch of particularly smaller climate resiliency projects under that and just move a lot forward, move a lot quicker that way.
I'll just end with where I started, and I think even broader than the permitting process, the design process. I would love to see a shift from prescriptive, code-based mandate design to performance-based design. I think that would be really helpful to start the conversation early and think about the performance objectives day one rather than a prescriptive requirement for what needs to be done.
I don't follow instructions well, so I say yes to my co-panelist suggestion, so that's 3 already. And I have 3 that I want to add to it. One is staff up the agencies, please. We need to have more people doing the reviews, right? That's part of the delay, at least in one of the departments that I work closely with. You can't do the review if you don't have the people, so staff them up. Municipal jobs are great jobs, and I want more people to go into agency positions. And we need better interagency coordination. I agree with Hilary, local agencies know best, but there are some projects that require multiple agency reviews, and those agencies really need to be working together, communicating together. That was something that Mayor's speed plan recommended as well, that level of interagency coordination. That needs to be institutionalized somehow so that it happens every time there's a project. And the third is a pie in the sky, and I'm sorry to take up a little time, but I grew up in Tokyo, and I go back frequently. I am amazed by the kind of capital projects that get implemented in Tokyo. We've added whole new subway lines in the last 40 years, multiple subway lines and trains. We've added new stations along existing lines. We've added a huge stormwater detention tank. These projects seem to move much faster in Tokyo, which, by the way, is a super bureaucratic city. Country as a whole is very bureaucratic, right? You have to fill out 30,000 pages of paper to file anything, but things happen quickly. My guess, and it's not like I did research, but as a country, we have this mentality that we do things for the collective good, right? So adding more subway lines is a collective good. It doesn't just serve you, it serves everybody. And that kind of valuing of collective good is not something I see a lot here. But we have to start thinking about what is good for the collective, because climate is going to affect every single one of us. It doesn't matter where you live, what you do, how much money you make, we are impacted already. So unless we together think about what is best for the collective, not necessarily for your own property value, then we can't really do the things we need to do. So that's one thing I'd like to change. I don't know how, but I'm throwing it out there.
And we've got about 5 minutes to take some questions from the audience, so right up front here.
Hi, we've talked a lot about policy for climate change and resilience, you mentioned regulations, but at least at the federal level, regulations we deal with are 50 years old now. And the intent was well served at the time. Do you think it's time that we look at the intent of some of those regulations? I mean, we weren't dealing with climate change issues in the 70s, and the intent of the rules was to protect aquatic resources. Now, we're in a world that's completely different when those rules went into effect.
I'll just get back on my high horse about about the precipitation codes, which, you know, we're using codes from decades ago. And so it's awareness and knowledge of the changes and being able to communicate that and understanding, again, what is the best for each individual project to achieve the performance that you want to have when the project is built. And you're not going to get that from a code-based approach. So, you know, and these things take decades to change, and then once they change, they're already out of date. So I think, again, moving away from this prescriptive methodology to a performance-based methodology is just the way of future building.
I also agree, and I think not only would it allow more flexibility in terms of, you know, meeting regulations, I guess, but particularly during the environmental review process, you know, one of the things that we've looked at, and as I said, we're assessing what impacts we're prioritizing, but also, you know, what can technical reviewers look at? One of the reasons that the city seeker technical guidance got so prescriptive is that the technical reviewers at DEP and DOT are engineers and feel comfortable with prescriptive methodologies that they approve. But that's not really what environmental review is. And if we can sort of shift the methodology to a performance outcome, they might be more comfortable with that, and we can be more flexible. And then we also have to update it all the time, because with air quality, with hazmat, with everything, it changes, and we wouldn't have to do that so much, and we would have that flexibility, and they would too.
There's a question in the back.
First of all, thank you to the panel. My name is Zachary D'Amato with Urban Rivers. We build floating green infrastructure, so you can imagine the permitting process is laborious. We experience a lot of interagency delays, for the lack of a better word. What do you feel is the systemic issue with this lack of communication on a project that, from a green space perspective, is for everyone?
I mean, it's just like every other, you know, there's organizational culture, there's institutional, you know, momentum and its own kind of inertia that gets behind all of this, right? And unless it is, you know, built up and down an organization that you have to speak to other people, you have to work together to get things done, and there's, you know, leadership from the top enforcing that, you know, it is difficult to get it done consistently. At Abundance New York, we recommend the creation of a resilience authority at a state level that would be able to work across jurisdictions and across agencies, specifically on climate resiliency, to treat it with the type of urgency it needs, and that would be empowered to do both the permitting and in some cases the building itself of the infrastructure. And, you know, RPA's called for this kind of thing in the past. There's been lots of calls for this kind of thing, and interagency coordination is a huge issue within the city agencies, between the city and the state, between the city and state and federal level. Like, it's all very challenging, and to the extent we can reduce that by actually just having an agency focused on this existential problem, we'd be better off, we think.
So I'm a former government employee, so my question is kind of selfish. So prescriptive standards and thoughts are often what you're taught as like a young government person. And I know that there's also things that the government can't talk about with, you know, the private sector, but it sounds like private sector thought leadership to an extent is needed. And so I'm wondering if you've seen ways where you've seen the government, you know, collaborate at least to kind of get some of that thought leadership. If you've got great examples, I'd love to hear them where you've seen it done well.
We always collaborate with, you know, yes, the city likes to keep control, like for example, over the secret technical manual methodologies, but we often collaborate with the private sector, with community groups, consultants, I always get people, and many of the city agencies, like DOT in particular, the transportation consultants are proposing other ways to do transportation analysis in the city. And we really do look to other, we collaborate a lot with other jurisdictions. But yes, I'm, hearing Robert and, all the city workers or government workers in the room, their, agency culture can vary. Some agencies are extremely rigid and conservative, some are less so. And so it kind of, depends. My job is interagency coordination. What you're suggesting is why my office was formed 30 years ago, and I think we're doing a great job, but it's not perfect, and there's a lot to do. But some of that I think is kind of a myth. Like, we don't have to be so protective at times, and that's just, professions evolve. I'm aware law has evolved, and there's newer thinking.
I'm going to also respond just very quickly and then dismiss everyone to lunch. I think this is actually a place where Waterfront Alliance's WEDG, Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, actually fills an important gap. And we're seeing that different agencies in different cities across the country are adding WEDG as kind of a layer over top of regulatory processes. Doesn't necessarily slow down the process because it goes in, in tandem and synchronously. But we are looking at this combination of resilience, ecology, and access, and the community benefits that go with those, and are showing up in requests for proposals from agencies. Different agencies are building us into their standard practices for their own projects. We're in zoning code up in New Rochelle. So there's instances where kind of WEDG fills this gap, particularly for communities that don't have, the Michael Morella, who has great waterfront expertise around them, and that they don't have that kind of in-house capacity. With that, lunch is next. Lunch is served on the second floor. If you are going on one of the tours, you're actually going to go grab a box lunch, not get in the long buffet line. And then those tours are meeting outside. Enjoy, and thank you all. Thank you, panelists.